Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight, Infrastructure Investment Policies, the Potential Impacts for Climate Change and Labor. This was a shared effort of the Washington, D.C. Alumni Club, the College of Engineering, and the Ford School. My name is Dana Simons. I am the Programming Committee Co-Chair for the University of Michigan Alumni Club of D.C. I want to welcome you tonight. I just want to say a big thank you to Christine Mushanek from the College of Engineering, who really helped put this event together. I hope you enjoy. I'm just going to go through a couple slides real quick as people are kind of coming in and getting situated, and then the speakers will start in just a few moments. So just a quick few things at UMDC, and at any point you guys have any questions or comments on UMDC, feel free to send me an email. I know we have some folks, I think, that are maybe not from the DC region, but welcome. We're glad to have you here tonight. If you are located in DC and you're interested in volunteering with our club, there's an email address on the screen. You can send an email to that as well, and they'll kind of put you in touch with the right people. We're always looking for volunteers for our programming committee, our community service committee, and especially looking for some folks looking to do communications and social media for the club. All of our information, including to donate, to buy our merch, to all of our events are on our website at umdc.org. And we also send out a weekly newsletter. If you don't get that, make sure you sign up for that. And we're active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at UMichDC. So we hope you'll follow us if you don't already. I'll pop those links in the chat a little bit later. We do have a bunch of upcoming events that I wanted to share with you. Some are virtual and some in person. So if you're not local, you can still come to some of them. Next Thursday, we have an event with another Michigan professor, Scott Ellsworth, who will be speaking on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. We have our virtual podcast club on July 27th. And our first in-person event after a year and a half, we're very excited. On August 3rd, we're doing our annual meeting and a happy hour at Midlands in DC, followed by a baseball game. Nibble and Network for Capitol Hill staffers is our monthly lunchtime networking event. And finally, a very DC event to kind of kick off our in-person events with the Monuments by Moonlight tour and picnic in mid-August. So we hope if you're local, you'll come and join us for some of these events. Just a quick rundown of tonight. We are recording this event, and closed captioning is available if needed. It should be on the bottom of the screen. You can toggle it on or off. This evening, our speakers will each speak for a few minutes on a topic kind of related to the event tonight. And then at that point, you can start asking questions in the chat box, and they'll get to that when they get to the Q&A portion in about 15 or so minutes. I do want to introduce our speakers, and then I will turn it over to them. Victor Li is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and directs the Center for Low Carbon Built Environment. His research focuses on the design, processing, and characterization of smart fiber reinforced cementitious composites for protective and sustainable built environments. Volker Sick is a professor in the College of Engineering and the director of the Global CO2 Initiative. His research focuses on accelerating deployments of CO2 utilization technologies that will innovate existing infrastructure and manufacturing processes, thereby finding sustainable decarbonization solutions to help address the climate crisis. And Betsey Stevenson is a professor of public policy and economics and a visiting associate professor of economics at the University of Sydney. She is a labor economist who focuses on the labor market and the impact of public policies and outcomes both in the labor market and for families as they adjust to changing labor market opportunities. So thank you. Enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to Volker, who will continue the event.
Dana, thank you so much. And welcome everyone who connects with us tonight. It's great to have you in this event where we hope we share some interesting elements about recent legislative action that I think pertains to all of us and in our daily lives. Specifically, we want to look at the impact, the potential impact of the infrastructure investment policies, right? And how they are linked with climate change, with labor and workforce development. You'll hear quite a bit from us, and we want to engage in a conversation with you about this. But I also want to emphasize one thing that's very important to keep in mind. Whereas in the broader federal context, the infrastructure bill addresses a lot of topics that goes beyond what we want to focus on tonight. Here, we are focusing on what's probably called the built environment, houses, bridges, roads, etc. We're not talking about services, which in a broader context could also be understood as infrastructure. Again, buildings, roads, bridges, etc. So that's really the focus of tonight. And I think what we want to drill down into is the importance of policies, their impacts, why they are needed, why it's essential that these policies are stable and lasting, because infrastructure, as you can easily imagine, is something that is not built in a day. So everyone sort of involved in that from investment point of view in particular must have stability in these endeavors. But specifically, why am I interested in this? Why is it of relevance to the Global CO2 Initiative that I represent? Because in the broader context of climate change, we certainly have all understood by now that our future depends on the ability to derive a net zero carbon economy. That is, we might still add CO2 to the atmosphere, but what we add in surplus, we need to remove. And that's really critical. It's really critical that we do this fast. We already see around us the impact of what has happened because of the excessive CO2 in the atmosphere. And as such, really fast and decisive action is needed. And one of the problems is that we cannot just stop doing what we're doing for many reasons. Of course, we cannot just stop driving and making things while we learn to sort of decarbonize or defossilize those kind of processes. We need to at the same time build up technologies that at a very large scale can help remove CO2 and dispose of it. Now, you have probably heard about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That is a term that collects a myriad of technologies that all start with somehow capturing carbon dioxide gas and either pumping it underground and storing it, or that's what we want to focus on tonight, utilizing it for something that we might need anyway or have not made out of CO2 so far. Victor will in particular talk about this in a little while. So what is the problem? I seem to indicate that technologies are available. We need to just scale them up, and then we're off to go. But the problem is that these technologies are needed to produce gigatons, billions of tons of material every year. So we need to build a lot. We need to build it fast. And to avoid making the wrong choices, we really need to be very diligent in assessing what makes economic sense, what makes environmental sense. That's the key in particular, so that we're not betting on the wrong horse and make the situation for the environment worse. So how do we do this here at the University of Michigan? We have a larger team of researchers that look at what are the impacts on the environment, what are the impacts on economics, so that people are enabled to choose the right technologies. And it doesn't stop there. You also hear in the context of carbon neutrality and these growing numbers of carbon neutrality commitments, which is fantastic. Even though many don't even know how to get there, but making the commitment regardless is a big thing. So we are here to help them figure out how to do this, but we're also here to help with the accounting. You need to be diligent, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be clear that if somebody buys offsets, they are real offsets and not just on paper, that are not sold twice, etc. Lots of interesting things that pose fantastic research questions, of course, with very practical, large-scale implications, but also opening up opportunities for a lot of new jobs. And I think Betsey will talk about those aspects in a broader context. I would stop here and ask Victor to share some of his work and his thoughts on the topic.
All right. Okay, thank you, Volker, for laying out the groundwork. So I'm a civil engineer, and coming from that angle, I see that what we are facing is really a triple challenge, dealing with, number one, the crumbling infrastructure, as Volker pointed out, bridges, roads, and whatnot that requires repeated repair and maintenance that is decidedly not sustainable. There is the other problem in relation to climate change. Our temperature on the surface of the earth is rising much too fast. And concrete actually, and concrete infrastructure contributes to that. The United Nations, for example, came out with a report way back already 2017 that suggested that about 40% of all the carbon emitted comes from the built environment. So this is a challenge, a problem. And in fact, the climate impact comes back with a problem for infrastructure in the sense that the resiliency of the infrastructure against severe climate changes needs to be enhanced to deal with climate changes. And then the third problem, of course, is jobs, as Volker pointed out. And in the construction industry, it does provide a lot of jobs, and it's an important part of the economy, no question about that. Unfortunately, construction sites, for example, is one of those places where young people tries to avoid today, partly because of the challenge of working in construction site environment, but also because of the high fatality rates in this particular industry. So I think the question in front of us is, how do we deal with all these three challenges? Is there a solution that addresses all of these three things: crumbling infrastructure, climate change, and jobs? Fortunately, in my mind at least, I think there is a solution that may contribute to a simultaneous solution to all these three problems. And that is carbon sequester concrete with extreme durability. Concrete that can not only emit less, but actually take in carbon and lock it up as a permanent storage of carbon dioxide. And at the same time, that is extremely durable, exceptionally durable compared to conventional concrete. So the question that may be asked is, what is this kind of concrete? Well, if you look at the current crumbling infrastructure, a lot of it has to do with cracking in concrete material. Cracks allows water and aggressive agents to enter the concrete, causing corrosion and spalling of concrete and so on. And if we can create a concrete that is ductile, like metal, that would be extremely interesting, and we would be able to build bridges and roads, houses, hospitals, schools that will last substantially longer than the current versions. So as we renew our infrastructure, it's important in my mind to keep these in perspective, that we certainly don't want to have another round of $1 trillion, multi-trillion dollars of investment within the next 10, 15, 20 years. We would like to be able to build very infrastructures that are extremely durable, that doesn't require repeated maintenance, that simultaneously can serve to reduce carbon dioxide, absorb it permanently into the infrastructure and make that useful. as a result, not only just storing and putting it away, but actually make it better to serve resilient infrastructure. So I'll stop at that. And maybe Betsy, you like to pick up from here?
Sure. So I want to just thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. It's, as I'm sure all of you can see, I'm sort of an odd one out in that I don't have any knowledge about the actual mechanical side of physical infrastructure. So I wanted to comment a little bit on where we are politically with infrastructure packages, why I think there's going to be challenges getting it done, and what, as an economist, I would see as the one ideal solution, and then also where are we with the labor market today, and how's that going to necessarily play a role? So President Biden has proposed a sweeping infrastructure bill, and as Volker mentioned at the beginning, the idea of this infrastructure bill was to think really broadly about what do we need to thrive as a country, to be as productive as possible, to be as successful as possible, to be able to really experience rapid economic growth again. And it's not, in that case, it's not just about physical infrastructure, it would be about human infrastructure. But when it comes to thinking about climate change and about what you've been hearing about, that's a real conversation around physical infrastructure. So I'll focus there. I made a comment when we were preparing for this meeting that it wasn't just the Trump administration that felt like it was always infrastructure week. When I worked in the Obama White House, I felt like we were always trying to push infrastructure. We were trying to get more funding for infrastructure. And my view on the politics of this is that everybody loves to talk about infrastructure because both Republicans and Democrats, in theory, support fixing bridges and roads in our crumbling infrastructure. So where's the hang up? Why are we always talking about it and never really doing it? The hang up is all in how we fund it. And that is, you're seeing the fights right now. Democrats agree on a $3.5 trillion package. Republicans throw up their hands and say this is wildly irresponsible. You heard there was some bipartisan agreement for a much smaller package. Depending on how you count it, a $1.2 trillion package. But a lot of that was sort of repackaging money that had already been approved for other things. So what's the challenge? The challenge is finding new revenue sources. How are we going to pay for the things that we want to do? A really natural way that economists think about how we should pay for these things is we should try to think about making sure that the true costs of things are reflected in their price. And so almost every economist, whether you're on the right or the left politically, really wants to see a carbon tax. And the reason is that if you have a carbon tax, we're sort of going to let markets rip, and we'll get better use of new technologies because we'll be having the old technologies have to face their true real cost. And that allows market forces to do a little bit more of the guiding. And because it's a tax, it also raises revenue, which you can use to do other things that are not going to be done through market forces. So why is it so hard to get a carbon tax done? Well, on the Republican side, it's a new tax, and Republicans are not usually very excited about a new tax. As many of you might know, over the last several decades, Republicans have signed the No New Tax Pledge that Grover Norquist has asked them to sign. So that makes it tough on the Republican side. And on the Democratic side, the problem with something like a carbon tax to fund things, or raising gas taxes to say fund our crumbling roads to reflect the true cost of driving on those roads, is that these taxes are regressive. They affect lower income people more than they affect higher income people. And that makes a lot of people really cringe at the idea of raising money to address climate change, to address our infrastructure on disproportionately on the backs of lower income people. So in a regressive way. And I think one response to that is that, first of all, climate change is going to be incredibly regressive. So, if it comes at the cost of not doing anything about climate change, it's not clear you've helped out lower income folks by avoiding the kinds of taxes like carbon taxes and gas taxes that would help us address climate change. But the second answer, again, really coming from that economic perspective, is that it's much better for us to get the true cost of carbon right. So when people are making decisions about whether to invest in the new technologies you've just heard about or not, whether to spend for the carbon sequestering concrete or use some other material, we want to see prices giving that edge, that incentive to the new technologies that are going to help fight climate change. And so using our tax system to help get those prices right. And when I say right, it's what economists call taking account of the externalities, the negative effects of carbon, or doing it the other way, subsidizing the positive effects of something that might be reducing carbon. Getting those prices right is a first order effect that we can do through our tax system. And we can use other ways of dealing with redistribution in order to think about the regressive effects of those taxes. Now, I said the final thing I wanted to comment on is the current state of our labor market. US economy is in such a weird place right now. We have something, we're short about 10 million jobs still compared to where we would have been if we hadn't had the pandemic. So about 7 million jobs less than what we had in the pandemic, but we would have kept growing had it not been for the pandemic. So we're down a lot of jobs, but the prices of things are going up. The prices of things are going up because we've had this really weird response, which is we didn't buy a bunch of stuff in 2020 because we were all hunkering down and we all want to buy it now, but a lot of the supply chains have shut down. And the cost of doing business has changed. I was just telling a friend that the cost of my son's summer camp week is gone up enormously, but it's gone up because they've had to implement a lot of new costly COVID protocols. So that's not inflation, that's real costs because they're running a different kind of camp. They're now running camp that's going to educate my son on biology, but it's also going to keep him safe from COVID. So that a lot of people might be saying, oh, this is a weird time to pass a big infrastructure bill. But I would argue that these things are really transitory, these kind of supply constraints, and it takes a while to get things done. So we actually do want to pass that infrastructure bill now, because I think by the time these projects get going, we're going to be past these supply humps. And we're already starting to see some of the devastating effects of climate change right now in the United States. So postponing action further is going to have long run negative consequences. So putting all that together, I think it's really important that we move forward now and we realize that the kind of price increases we're seeing right now are really transitory. They're going to come down. And by the time we're ready to actually really have those construction workers on the job, implementing these new infrastructure implementing what we're putting forward with an infrastructure package that gets passed by Congress, say this fall or late this summer, I think we'll be past those supply constraints. So I will end there, and I look forward to conversation and questions.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Victor. Victor, if you come online again as well.
Sure thing.
Would like to invite the audience to submit questions or comments, either in general for all three of us or targeted to a particular person. Just type them in the chat, and I will see to take them and direct them. And I would like to start with maybe a question for both Betsy and Victor. I mean, we've heard from you, Betsy, that back in the Obama administration, there was talk about the infrastructure, of course. In Michigan, we seem to be the world leaders and experts in potholes and roads and all that. So, I mean, why is there not faster progress in infrastructure spending when we've been talking about this for so long?
So I'm happy to start and just say I really do think that a lot of this comes down to the revenue. It's just raising the money and being willing to spend money on infrastructure projects. I think that we're, we do have a lot of different levels of government in terms of who's going to spend what. So when you talk about Michigan, you're talking about state level government, right? And we've seen campaigns won on fix the damn roads. I think, I personally think that we're sort of in a bad space where Americans don't trust politicians. Trust in the American political system is at historic lows. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that we don't have good roads. We don't have good public toilets. These are things that just are about everyday life and they're not there. And then we get in a place where people don't trust their politicians. When they don't trust their politicians, it becomes harder to actually fund these kinds of projects. And we're now in this vicious circle where we don't trust them, so we don't want them to spend our money. We don't want to give them money, but then they can't build the things that would make our lives better, that would make us feel better about government.
Yeah, thank you. Victor, do you have an engineering perspective to that?
Well, from the fact that I direct the Center for Low Carbon Built Environment, I have opportunities to talk to infrastructure financiers, developers, builders, material suppliers, the AEC industry, architecture, engineering, construction industry. And I actually find, to put this on a little bit more positive note, I find that there is a tendency to or a stronger and stronger inclination towards developing more sustainable solutions in the construction industry. And just yesterday, I was reading an article on McKinsey where they asked 100 senior construction executives what trends they expect to accelerate due to COVID-19. And surprisingly, 53%, the article cited, more than 50% mentioned sustainability would be the expected acceleration. That was a report coming out from McKinsey yesterday. So I see a lot of this positive mindset, and really the question, and maybe I'm just rephrasing your question, Volker, is there a way to synergize public policy and this positive mindset to get to where we need to go as a society? I think we all agree that there is a lot of benefit, but I also see complexity in the sense that those entities I mentioned in the value chain of construction, they are often disconnected. They are connected and then they are also disconnected. They work in their own separate ways. They are not always aligned. And so there needs to be some way of gluing this and creating a coherent vision. I'll be curious how you two think about that.
So Victor, just one of the reasons I'm so bullish on carbon taxes and using prices is because I think the technology is out there. I think the private sector's interest is out there. I think we need to create the financial incentives for them to be able to run with a lot of it on their own. The US is never going to be a place where things are successfully done by being managed from the top. What we have to do is create incentives that will allow, what I would like to figure out is how do I get all these billionaires to think about solving climate change instead of going into space, right? And that's part of that is going to come from getting prices right. It's also going to come from, I think, putting out the sort of ego challenge, who can, that might motivate some people in the same way that like getting into space is clearly motivated partially by ego.
That's an interesting point.
That certainly is an aspect, but in all fairness to many of them, actually, billions of dollars from this community actually are being poured into a climate change related projects. So, but yeah,
I want to make
I thought about the carbon footprint of that recent flight too. But I think one question that I would like to take from the audience is about energy, and of course that's closely related to what we're talking here. Reports this week about the clean energy standards in the democratic reconciliation side of the infrastructure deal. And what is our opinion is asked. How likely do you think that this will actually get passed? And what other aspects of energy infrastructure do you think will get passed? Probably closest to you, Betsy.
So I think that Democrats are definitely want to be able to use a combination of carrots and sticks to be able to incentivize things like the clean energy standard. So to dive into the weeds for just a second, right? We've all started, I think all of us are learning more about reconciliation than anybody ever knew prior to maybe the past administration. But they're trying to figure out what kinds of things can get jammed through this process where they only need to get all the Democrats, right? So they need 50%. And I think that's I think trying to get something like that through reconciliation could be kind of tough. I'm not an expert in what the Senate parliamentarian will allow to be included or not included, but I think the chances of successful negotiation with Republicans on something like that is actually quite low.
Yeah, well, we'll see, I think. I think related to sort of this is also a question about looking at sort of the current or expected financial influx versus longer term sustained government action as we think about infrastructure. I mean, is this, I mean, in absolute terms, of course, a massive flash in the pan, or is it enough to then get us going, or how much continued investment is needed to secure the infrastructure that we so direly need? Maybe Victor, from your point of view, you spoke about sort of durability before.
Yeah, so yeah, I was thinking about this as you asked this question, also thinking about what Betsy mentioned earlier in terms of public policy and the private sector. So someone mentioned to me the other day that the biggest purchaser of concrete for infrastructure is the federal government. That is a very strong power, and that may be a way to leverage this this aspect in order to maybe modify the market in a way that would be beneficial to society. So maybe Betsy have comments on this, but the other point related to energy also triggered me to think about the fact that cement production is very energy intensive. That's part of the reason why there is also a very strong carbon footprint associated with construction. About 8% of all carbon dioxide emitted by human activities comes from cement production, for example. The amount of concrete that we use today is roughly about 3 tons per person per year. It's a huge, just huge amount of material talking about. So with respect to the making of cement, you need energy. The cement kilns actually requires very high temperature, about 1600 degrees C, to cause calcination. So that is actually part of the reason why cement production creates so much carbon, because of the calcination process that breaks down the calcium carbonate into calcium oxide and carbon dioxide that are then externalized. And then there is the fuel that needs to bring the temperature up. And so clean energy could actually be helpful in that regard. I think the cement industry would be would welcome that kind of realization of and lower their energy and carbon footprints as a result. I think, and that would be beneficial to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is a stunning fact about concrete. It's going to stick with me. I wanted to talk about your point you raised. That the federal government has enormous purchasing power, and one of the things, probably the most power that a U.S. president has to do things on their own without Congress, is through government purchases, because the president is the chief executive of the government, and through the Procurement Act is allowed to make changes as long as they benefit the economy and efficiency of providing goods for the American and services for the American public. And when I was in the Obama administration, that's literally what I worked on all the time, was changing the rules around procurement, because we were like, okay, I can't give paid sick leave to all Americans, but we could give it to federal contractors. We can't require that all businesses, that we can't make it illegal for all businesses to discriminate against LGBTQ people, but we can make it illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ people in federal contracting, right? So you have this power. It's not unlimited. You can't do whatever you want, but it is a power. And I think that there is a lot of space where the current administration is going to have to decide how bold they want to be on climate change and infrastructure in terms of what they're going to be willing to do to go it alone. Now, no administration wants to come out of the gate and just start doing all that stuff on their own. They want to try to get it done through Congress. So I think if you see failure over the next 12 months, what we're going to see is a pivot towards doing a lot more through changing the rules around federal contracting. And you're absolutely right that not only does it change the incentives because the government's the biggest purchaser, but now if you're trying to meet their standards, you don't want two standards. So you might as well start doing that in the rest of your business. And that's the reason why being such a big purchaser can make such a big difference, because you're going to change the cost benefit calculation for doing it, not just for federal contracting, but potentially through other projects.
I agree. I think that's really important point from the federal government, which can propagate down to the state level. Talking about concrete roads and so on, it goes to the Department of Transportation, the state DOTs, and they pour a lot of concrete. A lot of the funds comes from the federal government to the states. And then, of course, as we all know, construction is a local business in the sense that the ready-mix plants that makes the concrete cannot travel too far. So it needs to go back and forth between the city level, state level, and federal government and back. It would be great if and I don't know enough how that all works, but I think there is a need to connect those different scales and propagate the policy in such a manner as to maximize the positive mind frame that I was talking about, that the various entities of the value chain of construction do want to move forward to enhance sustainability. Right. To me, the infrastructure renewal is really, this to me is a great opportunity that we must not spoil.
Right, and having sort of heard and talked about the power that various combinations of subsections of the government have in this, I think, even though in the framing of the event, I emphasize that we're talking about the built environment of the infrastructure bill, it is critically important to recognize that in particular in that context, we can do a lot for underserved and disadvantaged communities, right? Because part of the reason that they are in that predicament has also to do with the lack of appropriate infrastructure. Can you both reflect on those aspects of what the prospects and the needs are there, and how such a bill and technologies we talk about can make a difference?
Well, Volker, it's this interesting that you brought this up. So that makes me recall a conversation I had with the mayor's office in Dearborn, city of Dearborn, which is this audience would know very well, the next town. And they were interested in a concrete that we developed that is very crack resistance. And as I mentioned, durable, extreme durability is what we desired. But it turns out Dearborn was not particularly interested only in that, but rather they pointed out that there is a need to rebuild the riverfront area for the community, and that they are very sensitive to making sure that there is good accessibility by the wheelchair community, the local community in wheelchair, physically challenged. And so I was scratching my head in that conversation. What does that have to do with concrete? Well, it turns out that for wheelchair users, cracked concrete with a step, once they break, it's very challenging to move the wheelchair around. So that's something I think stuck in my mind, that as we rebuild our built environment, it's not just technical things that we pay attention to, but we need to also meet social needs.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from one of our participants about carbon taxes, applications globally. Do we have examples of successes or failures? As an example, France is mentioned. Betsy, do you have any?
Well, I was going to talk about Canada because Canada introduced a carbon tax. It was challenged. It went to all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court, and it was just upheld by the Supreme Court a few months ago. So Canada's carbon tax will go forward, and I think that that's actually one of the challenges for the United States will be operating, if we don't do any kind of carbon pricing, operating in a world in which other countries are doing carbon pricing. And I think we've just seen countries having to get together to start talking about corporate taxes and a global corporate tax. The same thing will happen with carbon pricing. We're going to get individual.
It's frozen.
Yeah. Overseas cable to Australia disrupted. Hoping that
infrastructure
we get her back. Yeah, here we go. Build infrastructure. Betsy, you were cut off for a bit.
Yeah, I saw you guys freeze, so I realized I must have been. I was just I don't know where I ended, but I was saying that I think at the end of the day we'll have to have some sort of global agreement, because it's going to be really hard to sustain different carbon pricing mechanisms across the globe. But they're clearly starting to take off, and that may be what ultimately puts pressure on the United States.
Right. Is there not also in that context a very lively conversation in Europe about a carbon border tax? So in the midst of all these conversations about tariffs that we've heard over the last few years, this is yet another such threat to a global harmonious economy. Or
well, you don't need it if we all have the same carbon tax. But if Canada's putting their carbon tax in, what they don't want is to be able to import things that from other countries where they didn't have to pay the carbon tax. That puts their country at a comparative disadvantage for no reason other than that they're trying to price carbon correctly. So I think it almost requires a carbon border tax if you have a carbon tax domestically. And that's why I think at the end of the day, the better thing would be if we could all sort of agree on what our carbon tax was going to be. How do we price carbon in a way that means that we won't start to see, trade being driven by getting around carbon taxes.
Now, the mayor of Ann Arbor sort of proposes something like a carbon tax here locally, right? I mean, at the end of the day, whether you talk about a tax rebate or a tax, doesn't that mean that everything will become more costly to consumers? And somewhere the money must come from.
Well, so a carbon tax is about changing relative prices. So, if I want to buy something that, I mean, this is why, I love the example of carbon, sequestering concrete versus normal concrete, right? I don't know anything about the production, but if you don't have any kind of carbon prices going in, then the price difference between the two of them is false. Whereas if we say, hey, look, this concrete that's creating 8% of global CO2 emissions, it's not, if we're not putting that price in that concrete, then it's gonna look like the relative price, like that there's not as big of a gap in the relative price. If we put the higher price on that concrete, it gives people the incentive to on normal concrete, it'll give more of an incentive to switch over to carbon sequestering concrete. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We want you to say, when you're choosing between two goods, if one of them involves, look, air travel involves more, is going to involve more CO2 emissions than getting in your car and driving, 4 hours. So what I want is people to know that you're making an environmental choice there too, and I want them to face the full price of their decision. And so that means take into account the price of the carbon. So it doesn't mean prices have to go up on average. It means that the price of carbon intensive things should go up more than the price of less carbon intensive things. Now, there's this other thing, which is a carbon tax raises revenue. We could have something that was revenue neutral. We could cut taxes in some other way that would mean that we could actually keep prices down on average and just change that relative price mix. So it doesn't have to mean all prices go up.
Right. Oh, thank you for clarifying that. And I think that's sort of the kind of information that we try to provide with our life cycle and techno-economic assessments to sort of provide the arguments for Victor and his bendable concrete deployments. And there's actually a benefit, even though the upfront cost might be higher. It actually could mean in the long run, as the calculations show, you come out even better. Maybe Victor, you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we have been working in our laboratory on a new version of concrete. The media has been calling this the bendable concrete. So concrete normally is brittle like glass, but this material that we created at the U of M is actually bendable. It's like a metal that if you overload it, it bends out of shape, but it doesn't break into two parts. And that's the crack resistance that lends itself to creating extremely durable infrastructure that, believe it or not, can even repair itself, just like our skin. If we have a paper cut, it repairs itself. So this kind of concrete actually do that. And the relevance to infrastructure is low repair requirements. It just repairs itself. Isn't that very nice? So that's the kind of technology that I think could contribute. Is a platform technology that can contribute to many different things, but certainly more durable and more resilient infrastructure. Durable for reducing the carbon footprint of our built environment. Resilient because climate change is already here. We are not trying to defend it from coming in 20 years' time. It's already here. And we are seeing a lot of difficulty in our infrastructures, particularly those built in the coastal areas. Okay, so technologies like this, and not only our own, but other kinds of related technologies that contribute to greener, more sustainable infrastructure, I see that as actually creating opportunities to better quality and greener jobs. If you ask me what are they, aren't you actually eliminating labor, especially when you do go automation? I would argue that's not necessarily the case. There are new jobs going to be created because of technology involving carbon capture, carbon sequestration in concrete material, the making of these more advanced versions of concrete, the ability to manufacture with 3D printing of this kind of concrete. So instead of heavy labor, we use automation to robotics to actually create buildings. And low carbon build design, architecturally, and AI assisted smart construction using robots. Those are all technologies that would be creating new jobs. And these jobs would be greener and much higher quality than current construction jobs. So I would argue when people tell me that what we are doing could destroy jobs, I don't agree. I think we are changing the job picture.
Well, good prospects.
I was just going to add to that I think, the thing is we haven't seen really much labor productivity growth in construction in quite some time. And, that's a real problem for the industry. And, the challenge with productivity growth means to produce the same stuff, then you do need fewer workers. The question is, will we produce the same stuff, or will we produce more? Will we be doing different things? And, it's always hard to predict where the future is going to go. But what we've always seen in the past is when we get productivity growth in an industry, we actually see new and better jobs come about. And I think the classic story is when I was a very, very small child, I barely remember this, but I remember waiting in line with my mom to get cash out on during the week, because you had to go see a person at the bank to remove cash. Now, we got ATMs, and ATMs meant you could stick in a card and out would come cash and you no longer see a person. And people said, oh my gosh, all these tellers, bank teller was a great middle-class job. They're all going to lose their jobs. What we actually saw was growth in the number of jobs. And it was because instead of handing out cash, they started doing things that were more profitable, like selling people savings bonds and getting them into CDs and opening new accounts. So there is usually this kind of change, Victor. So I'm there with you. I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is that the American public can be very frightened of technological change. And so like when you tell me the sidewalk's going to heal itself, I'm a little creeped out. And I am actually like a technology optimist. So I was like, oh, I think that's kind of creepy. How do the Luddites feel right now? So I think that's a real thing for us to manage, is how do we manage people's fears around new technology?
Well, actually one of your colleagues in Ford School, Caitlin Rainey, and her team studies that, and other studies have been done at the Urban Institute to look at sort of what are consumer expectations and fears and worries. It's critically important. I absolutely agree.
You reminded me of the early days when the media came to our lab and reported our invention of bendable concrete, and it was reported in public media. And today, readers would be able to write comments below that piece, the video. And I still remember very well one of the comments created by the readers. And her comment was that, please tell me where this bendable concrete is used, and I'm not going to drive over that bridge, because I'm afraid that my car will be bouncing up and down given this bendable concrete.
Indeed, words do matter, and it's very complicated to sort of convey new technologies in a vocabulary that is sort of unknown to a broader audience. I think we see that every day. I think to everyone on the webinar call, Dana has just shared with you that we still have a chance to take questions. Of course, we are continuing to be available for comments or specific individual questions through our email. But if there's anything that you think you want answered here now by the panelists, please let us know in the chat or the Q&A entry boxes. I think we might have scared the audience now with bendable concretes and self-heating, even though from the Terminator movies, we should know how these things work, right? There's a hole and it just closes. Very simple. Wonderful. Anything that we have from the audience? Not question about how can we ensure carbon offsets actually result in offsets? Yeah, now we need another 2 hours to talk about this. This is one of my pet peeves, because it's really a difficult subject to really say, how is a CO2 reduction actually achieved, guaranteed, certified, and durable? If somebody promises me that they will not cut down a tree and call that an offset, this does not work. It's like me saying, you know what? I will not fly to Europe tomorrow, and therefore I avoid CO2, and therefore somebody should pay me for it. It's a big, big question. Betsy, let us hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. It's really hard because the economists usually say, I don't want to pay you to not do bad things, because that actually creates incentives for you to want to do the bad thing to get paid to not do the bad thing. So what I want to do is charge you for doing the bad thing, not pay you to not do the bad thing. And I think that's I think that's really important. And the carbon offsets, it's not something I know a lot about. It does seem like it relies a lot on trust, and that doesn't seem to be something that's working super well in the United States right now, trying to run policy based on people sort of trusting to do the right thing. But there's not like good, somebody tells me they're not going to cut down a tree, I don't seem to have any like way to verify that.
Right. But then there are companies emerging that do exactly that. They become sort of carbon offset banks that are being traded, that are being certified, and all that. So there's actually an example of how this can create new jobs.
And actually,
course,
so how the market will jump in. If we get the incentives right, markets will always jump in to try to solve the problem. Right. And that's like, well, I think that, let me just say one last thing, which is that a lot of people get really confused about what it means to be a capitalistic society or pro-market. And they think it means being pro-business. But the thing to realize is that existing businesses are not trying to have a thriving market economy. They're trying to protect all their current profits. And so what we want is to have a thriving market economy, is to encourage competition and to make sure that businesses are paying the true cost of what they're imposing on society.
Right, and I think that's what our tools with the life cycle assessments and techno-economic assessments actually provide. So the transparent and an objective measure of their true impact. So I think we are at time. Dana, back to you.
Thank you all so much. I am gonna pop in the chat real quick. The link for our donations for our scholarship, if you didn't donate when you registered and you'd like to, that's kind of our alumni club's main thing, is to raise money for our scholarship to send a local student to Michigan every year. So that's in there, and also our Instagram and Facebook. I just wanted to pop those in. But I do want to thank everyone for attending tonight, and to our speakers for a wonderful event. And hopefully you guys learned a lot. So thank you and have a good night, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.